I'm here to talk to you tonight about one of my 6 nonfiction books about Florida, which I call the most interesting state. It's Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country, which I have to tell you, when my agent sent this around to publishers in New York, 15 of them said, no, thank you, we think Florida's not that interesting. And one of them, thank God, said yes. And it made the New York Times bestseller list, got rave reviews in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. So I just want to say nya to those other publishers. But I love talking about Florida. As she mentioned, I am a native Floridian. So if a wildlife biologist comes in here and tries to tag me as an endangered species, that's why. And I love to talk about my native state because I just find it endlessly fascinating. There's just all kinds of stuff that even people who've lived here for a long time may not know. And so I wrote this book just to basically to inform people, yes, we're weird and we embrace that, but we do a lot of stuff that maybe influences other people that you may not even know about. So the book is divided into chapters by subject. So there's a chapter on what it's like to grow up in Florida. There's a chapter about the beach in Florida. There's a chapter about gambling in Florida. There's a chapter about driving in Florida. No, it's not the same as the chapter on gambling. And so after I sent the book in, after I submitted it, I was taking my kid home from school, and so the last chapter of the book is about taking him home from school and all the weird stuff we pass on the way home. Just, things that you might not necessarily notice, but things that if you know about it, you know. So to prove the point that Florida weirdness is wherever you look if you know what to look for. So on that path home, we passed by the house where the case of the naked nanny occurred. We passed by a building that was hit by a runaway blimp. We passed by a pirate ship that was used in both the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and a porn movie. The city was not happy about the porn movie. And other odd things. And so after I turned the book in, and after I turned the manuscript, and it was too late to make any changes, one day we're making that same trip home, and as we're driving by this museum in downtown St. Petersburg that has a big banyan tree up front, I noticed this woman is up in the tree, and she's got, she's got her blonde hair in ringlets. She's wearing this colorful Eastern European costume. She's got an accordion, and she's playing and singing John Denver songs. And so I pointed her out to my son, and I said, what do you think's going on with the woman in the tree with the accordion playing and singing John Denver songs? And he says, who knows, Dad? It's Florida. And I said, we are raising you the right way. That was the correct answer. Because the reason I say Florida is the most interesting state is there's just so many interesting things about it. We tell people we're the Sunshine State. That's a lie we basically tell the tourists, because really a lot of our cities get more annual rainfall than Seattle does, believe it or not. Pensacola, the city I'm from, is actually the second most rainy city in America. The first one is Mobile, which is like an hour away. So there's a lot of rain. So, but you know what? Florida has the most first magnitude springs, more first magnitude springs, not just than anywhere else in the country, anywhere else in the world. First magnitude referring to how much water gushes out from beneath the ground. The first person to write about that was William Bartram, who was a pioneering naturalist and came here and noticed that. And his writings about our springs actually inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his poem about Kubla Khan, where he writes about caverns measureless to man. So even before we were a state, we were influencing other people. We also have more fake dinosaurs than any other state. There's one that I particularly like. It's a fake dinosaur that's also a gas station in Spring Hill, and it's been around so long it's actually on the National Register of Historic Places, which I think that's very Florida that something fake is on the National Register of Historic Places. Most of our fake dinosaurs are at Dinosaur World, which is on I-4 near Disney, and used to be near the Holy Land experience. So you had both evolution and creationism sort of on the same road. Dinosaur World used to have 200 dinosaurs there for people who wanted to visit and look at them. But now they only have 199 because somebody stole one. Don't know why, don't know how. But if you happen to spot it, it answers to the name of Rex. They're still looking for it. So we have the nation's smallest police station. It's in Carabel. It's a phone booth. I think it's remarkable they still have phone booths. You just don't see those anymore. We have the nation's smallest post office. That's in Okeechobee. It's a tool shed. It's just big enough for the stamps. And I always like to mention Sweetwater, the town that was founded by a troupe of Russian circus midgets whose bus broke down. And they said, okay, this is the perfect place to build our little tiny houses. So, these are not things you would find anywhere else, only in Florida. A lot of my friends who are from Florida, they claim that, Florida wasn't weird till all those other people came down here, like it's the fault of all the Yankees who moved here from New York or whatever. And I say, no, that's not true. We've actually been weird for a long, long time. When we were a territory, before we became a state, we were actually known as a rogue's paradise. One visitor who came here in the 1830s wrote that he found that about half of Florida's residents seemed to be robbers and rascals, and the other half were their penniless victims. So not much has changed, really. Our very first state flag, when it flew over the state capitol in 1845, actually said "Let us alone" on it, which you could take as either a wish or a warning. And our first U.S. Senator, David Levy Yulee, claimed he was descended from Moroccan royalty. He was not. He was actually just Jewish, and he didn't want to tell people. But Florida's pioneers knew things about Florida that we modern residents seem to have forgotten. They knew some important stuff. One of the things they knew is that, they knew how hot it was here before air conditioning came along, so that's why they named a lot of places after hell. We've got Tate's Hell Swamp, we've got Lake Helen Blazes, we've got the Devil's Mill Hopper near Gainesville. And they often did something illegal for a living because they embraced that whole, YOLO lifestyle, you only live once. So they would lure ships onto the rocks and then strip them, or they would, hunt protected species. My favorite example comes from my hometown of Pensacola. Back when the Navy had wooden warships, the Navy owned forests where they would cultivate the trees they needed to build their warships. There was a big oak forest in Pensacola for the Navy, and people kept sneaking onto Navy property and cutting down the trees and hauling the lumber off for their own use. Stealing from the government. And the U.S. Marshal at the time wrote to his boss that he couldn't do anything about it because half the grand jury was involved. They also knew that life here could seem totally random. People back then didn't go to the beach for recreation. They went to the beach to shop because things would wash ashore that they might need. They would look for and often find clothing. They'd find lumber. They'd find cookware. In one rather remarkable example, they actually found a ship that washed up that contained 300 coconuts. And they thought, well, what are we going to do with these? So they planted them, and that's how Palm Beach got its name. Another fairly important thing that the pioneers knew that we often forget is that Florida is constantly trying to kill us, which I tend to think about every year when hurricane season rolls around. We are the sinkhole capital of America. We have more sinkholes in Florida than anywhere else. That one in the picture, by the way, that happened in the town of Mulberry at a phosphate mine. And when this one opened up, and I mean, it's huge, it's gigantic. People actually jokingly called it the new Disney ride, Journey to the Center of the Earth. About several years later, another one about the same size opened about a mile and a half away from where this one is. We are the lightning capital of the Western Hemisphere too. So there's lots of zapping going on. And I have to tell you, I talked to a scientist at the University of Florida who studies lightning, and I thought, man, I'm glad I never met you when I was a little kid, because that would have been my life's goal, is to become the lightning guy. We are also the shark bite capital of the world. The east coast of Florida, there are 2 counties over there that are the place in the world where you are more likely to get bitten by a shark than anywhere else, including Australia. I think it's because we taste so good, but that's just me. We also get the most hurricanes making landfall in the U.S. I mean, we're like the chin that the North American continent sticks out into the Caribbean and says, hit me. And they usually do. And we are among the most vulnerable places to climate change. We're surrounded on 3 sides by water, and we're a very, very flat state, flatter than Kansas. So as the sea level rises, it comes further and further inland. Combine that with the hurricanes and storm surge and so forth, you see where I'm going. And of course, on top of all of this, we call it paradise, you know? So we got the sinkholes, the lightning, the shark bites, the hurricanes, climate change. Oh, and I forgot to mention the creepy clown college in Sarasota. But we won't talk about that. A lot of the weird Florida stories that you see involve our very kooky critters. For some reason, a lot of people think a good lifestyle choice is to own an exotic pet, and so things tend to go haywire with them. We've had stories about pythons, of course, tegus. They're kind of the new hotness after the pythons. I actually interviewed a guy in Tampa one morning. He was going out to take his garbage out, and he just sort of sensed that there was something looking at him, and he turned around, and there was an Argentine tegu this long, and it was hissing at him. And as a result, his wife has to take out the garbage now. We have the giant snails. Perhaps you've heard about the giant snails. They were all over in Miami-Dade County and some in Broward as well. They're actually sort of my favorite of all the invasive species because of how they got here. They were smuggled in by a religious cult that thought that drinking their mucus would make you healthy. It actually had the opposite effect, which is how the authorities found out about it. And it turned out that one woman had actually put several of them under her dress and gotten on a plane in Nairobi and flown to the United States that way. And these snails are gigantic. They're as big as my hand. So I just picture the guy in the seat next to her going, "Ma'am, did you know your dress is slowly undulating back and forth?" We have also, we've had stories about runaway llamas. The llama, this is from Leon County up in Tallahassee. This one had to be tasered by the cops in order to prevent it from getting away. On that same weekend, we had a runaway kangaroo in Pasco County, and they tried tasering it, and that did nothing. So finally, a guy who'd been a high school wrestler just wrestled it to the ground. These are not lessons you learn in police academy. And, you know, we've had a number of stories about people jumping on top of manatees and sea turtles. The manatee story, I don't know if you heard about this. This was a few years ago. It was in St. Pete Beach. This woman was in the water splashing around, and a manatee swam by, and people were like, "Oh, look at the cute manatee." And she jumped on its back and was like, "Woohoo, look at me, I'm riding the manatee." And people were like, "No, get off of it, get off of it. Woohoo, I'm having a great time." So what's the typical response of Americans to any unusual phenomenon? People pulled out their phones and shot video of her on the manatee, which enabled the police to then identify her and bring her to justice. She got kind of a slap on the wrist, really, from the authorities. I think that her real punishment was that pictures of her thighs were flashed around the world. And the guy who jumped on the sea turtle, it's like, dude, that is the slowest getaway vehicle possible. And, you know, we build our houses in what has been gator territory, bear territory, panther habitat. And then we're surprised that these animals show up in the backyard, you know? You got bears swinging in the backyard swing or climbing into your hot tub. You've got panthers peeking through the sliding glass door or gobbling up your backyard chickens. The gators are my favorite, though. They really are. You know, it's not just that they'll show up at 4 a.m. like some drunk relative banging on the door with their tail. but that they have actually been responsible for the capture of 3 suspects that were being sought by police. I mean, talk about taking a bite out of crime. Speaking of interesting critters, Florida, I never tire of pointing this out. Florida is the only state where the list of government jobs includes mermaid. Have any of you ever been to Weeki Wachee Springs State Park? You know what I'm talking about. The staff there, they are mermaids. In 1947, a former Navy frogman named Newt Perry, bought the spring, went in and cleaned out all the old refrigerators and junk that people had thrown in, and then hired these local women to pull on 60-pound prosthetic tails and swim around and wave at the tourists. It became a big success. A lot of big celebrities came to visit. Elvis came, for instance. And then around 2000, business sort of tailed off. And so, thank God, the state stepped in. Instead of letting a developer or a water bottler buy the place, the state stepped in and bought it and turned it into a state park and continued to employ the mermaids. They still put on their shows today. However, that has led to some interesting discussions about the use of taxpayer dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell bras. I always like to point out to people that the first national wildlife refuge was here in Florida. It was a place called Pelican Island here over on the East Coast. Pelican Island, so named because it was full of pelicans. So a lot of pelicans roosted there. And this was back in the early 1900s when a lot of poachers came to Florida and started blasting away at all the beautiful birds because they wanted their feathers for ladies' hats. They were just wantonly killing roseate spoonbills and flamingos and giant egrets, just anything. And they took out an awful lot of pelicans. And so there was a guy who lived next door to Pelican Island and was deeply offended by them hunting on Pelican Island. And so he went to a fledgling group called the Audubon Society and got them and enlisted them in trying to fight to save Pelican Island, the pelicans on Pelican Island. They went to the guy who was the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, and Roosevelt signed an executive order declaring that Pelican Island was a national wildlife refuge, the first of its kind. And this was such a great idea, it caught on all over the country. There are now hundreds of national wildlife refuges. Other countries have now copied us and have started their own national wildlife refuges. This story, though, has a very Florida twist to it because who do you think they hired to be the warden to oversee Pelican Island? The guy who lived next door. He was the one who cared about it. He was right there. Why not pick him for the job? And so he did it very faithfully for 20 years. And then a hurricane came through and all the pelicans left. And they said, oh, okay, you're fired. There are no more pelicans to protect. So fortunately, they came back. And I like to always point out that a Florida man is responsible for the Endangered Species Act, a guy named Nat Reed. He grew up in Jupiter. His mother said he was born with a fly rod in his hand because he loved fishing so much. And he was a bird watcher and just loved viewing Florida's natural bounty and realized it was going away. And so he got a job as a deputy secretary of the Interior in the Nixon administration, and with some like-minded bureaucrats and scientists, they sat down at a Chinese restaurant in Washington, D.C., and over their mugu gai pan, they drafted the terms of what became the Endangered Species Act, got it passed by Congress, got their boss Nixon to sign it, and it's all due to this Florida man. So whenever you hear those stories about, Florida man, calls 911 because his cat's not being admitted to the strip club, just remember that there were Florida men who did some good stuff too. Florida's politicians have often been pretty weird. Governor Sidney Katz, who was governor in the early 1900s, he usually carried a pair of 6 guns on his hip because he said the Catholics had sent hitmen to kill him. They did not. And he frequently ended his campaign speeches by saying that the Florida cracker only had 3 friends: Jesus Christ, Sears and Roebuck, and Sidney J. Katz. Sidney Katz, by the way, was not a professional politician. He was a minister from the Panhandle. And at one point there was a Baptist convention, and so everybody was supposed to kind of pitch in and provide housing for them. The convention was in Tallahassee. Reverend Katz was one of those who traveled to Tallahassee, and he happened to be put up at the governor's mansion. He had lots of questions about the governor's mansion. He examined it from top to bottom, and at the end of the week that he was there, he asked the governor at the time, "How much do you pay in rent?" And the governor said, "Well, I am very proud to say that thanks to the taxpayers of Florida, I don't pay anything in rent." And so Reverend Katz said, "Really?" And 3 weeks later filed to run for governor. He only served one term, by the way. The mayor of Cedar Key, do you know where Cedar Key is? It reminds me of Key West, only much, much smaller. The mayor of Cedar Key, at one point in 1890, was basically an island despot, an island tyrant who hired a thug as his town marshal, and the two of them would walk around ordering people to commit random acts for their amusement. Hey, you two headbutt each other, ha 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 ha. And people would do it because the marshal was carrying a shotgun and wasn't afraid to use it. A woman, unfortunately her name is lost to history, but this woman wrote to President Benjamin Harrison and said, "We're in desperate straits here. We have a mayor who's doing a reign of terror on our island. Please help us." And about that time, the mayor and his thug town marshal attacked the keeper of the customs house, who was a federal employee. And so President Harrison ordered the Navy to land in Cedar Key and depose the mayor. So that's as far as I can tell, the only military coup in U.S. history was in Cedar Key. I don't know why they don't recreate that every year, by the way, as sort of like a big celebration where, they'd have the Navy landing and they'd be chasing the mayor down the street and, people would throw beads. I think it'd be great. I really do. And lest you think these things are all ancient history, in 2016, a candidate for the U.S. Senate seat in Florida admitted that he had once drunk goat's blood. He'd sacrificed the goat and drunk its blood. And I asked him, what did it taste like? And he said, fame. He was not the only unusual candidate in that contest. He was the libertarian candidate. The Democratic candidate had accused his own wife of committing bigamy, and her trial on that charge had to be postponed because one of her breast implants sprung a leak. Again, this is not a news story you would see in any other state, only Florida. Here's the thing, is that, people ask me, well, has there ever been a Florida man president? Of course, that's a kind of a key question these days, isn't it? But no, there has never been a Florida man president. Mostly Florida has functioned to block or thwart presidencies. There was a Florida man involved in the Lincoln assassination. He botched his assignment and wound up posing for one of the first mugshots. There were Florida men involved in the Watergate burglary. They botched their assignment and all wound up with mugshots. In 1987, probably the best example I could think of, happened in 1987. The front runner for the Democratic nomination was a U.S. Senator from Colorado named Gary Hart. And there were rumors that Gary Hart was not being faithful to his wife. And so the Miami Herald assigned some reporters to follow him because he had said, "Follow me, you'll see I'm a dull guy." Well, they followed him and found out quite the opposite. They discovered he was having an affair with an actress named Donna Rice. And it turned out there was actually a photo of him with her, a photo of her sitting on his lap, and he's wearing they're next to a party boat, and he's wearing the party boat's polo shirt, and the name on the polo and the name on the back of the boat both were the same, and it was the Monkey Business. And his candidacy never recovered from that. Now, it was the Herald that broke the story initially, but the publication that found that photo and ran with it was another Florida-based publication. You may have heard of it. It was the National Enquirer, which at the time was based near Palm Beach, and was run by a guy who used to work for the CIA and psychological operations. If you sometimes look at the Enquirer and think, wow, I wonder if that's a CIA operation. Yeah, it could be. We don't know. And it's even more interesting because his godfather actually paid for him to acquire what had been a legitimate paper and turn it into a tabloid. The Godfather literally was a godfather. It was Frank Costello, the godfather of the New York Mafia, who loaned him the money. He was a very, very, I'm trying to think of a good word for it. He was very careful with his money. People would actually report seeing him out on the lawn in front of the National Enquirer measuring the blades of grass to see if it had been cut properly. But this led to a great invention. There was a certain point where all the newspapers in America that had been publishing in black and white began publishing in color, and most of them took their black and white presses and just junked them. Well, he was not like that. He was definitely into recycling. And so he started the Weekly World News as a recycling effort. It would be this black and white publication that would be even less tethered to the facts than the National Enquirer. The Weekly World News, you may recall, is the publication that told us that Elvis was still alive, there was a bat boy living in the caves of Kentucky, and aliens had visited U.S. senators. My favorite Weekly World News headline, by the way, is the one you see there, half human, half fish found in Florida, which is sort of the reverse of the mermaids from Wiki Watching. And I should mention, too, that there was another Florida publication, Florida Today, that became the model for USA Today. That's because the guy who started Florida Today, Al Newhart, he liked what he had done. Al Newhart was this Gannett executive. He lived in Cocoa. And people said that when Al wore his sharkskin suit, you couldn't tell where the shark started and Al left off. Al conceived of this new newspaper. They didn't have a daily newspaper in Cocoa, even though that's where the space program had gotten started. And he said, these folks who had been brought in to build rockets, they're very smart and they're very inquisitive and they want to know what's going on in the world, but they don't have a lot of time. And so his concept was, let's give them a paper where everything's fast, everything's colorful, everything's short, there's lots of bullet points. That's our solution to this. And so he created Florida Today, and then it became such a big success that Al was promoted and eventually became CEO of Gannett and created USA Today. So every time you see USA Today, think to yourself, that's because the paper in Florida worked. So now I want to tell you about a different publication, somewhat naughtier one. There's a chapter in the book you would not want to read while you're at a church picnic. It's the chapter called The Sunshine State. Promoters in the 20s especially, but later as well, used sex to sell the state to buyers from out of state. You guys probably all know about Carl Fisher, the guy who created Miami Beach out of what had been a barrier island full of mangroves by basically digging up the bay bottom and dumping it on top of the mangroves and declaring it a resort. Fisher in, say, February would pay women to wear what were then considered skimpy bathing suits and pose on the beach, and they'd take their pictures and circulate that to all the places where they had blizzards. And so, the people in like Cleveland would open the paper and the women would say, oh my, look how hot it is in Florida. And the men would say, yeah, look how hot it is in Florida. The promoters in St. Petersburg actually went Fisher one better. They created a phony housewives cleanliness committee, purity committee, that was officially filed a complaint with the mayor about what they called sea nymphs and their scanty clothing on the beach. So next time you see somebody in a skimpy bathing suit, call them a sea nymph and see how they like it. And the probably the most famous pinup model of all time, Betty Page, actually got her claim to fame from here in Florida. She was posed for pictures that were shot by a woman named Bunny Yeager, who was from Florida. She had been a pinup model herself. That's her with the camera. She decided she wanted to be a creator, not a cheesecake person. And so she actually designed the costumes and sewed them herself, picked the settings, took the pictures, developed them, and she made Betty Page a big star, but Bunny Yeager, meanwhile, made a lot of money too. And sold them to a brand new publication named Playboy. Also, I should mention that probably the most famous X-rated movie of all time, Deep Throat, was actually filmed in Miami Beach. And much like the National Enquirer, was financed by the mafia. Apparently the mafia has a lot of cash to invest in things. So if you need investment, call them up. And Florida also has, and this shouldn't surprise you considering our weather, Florida has more nudist resorts than any other state. And in fact, Pasco County is considered to be the nudist capital of the world because it has so many, including one that was started there in 1948. The thing about the nudist resorts in Florida is they have just about any kind you want. They have for the folks who really want to put on the dog while they're taking off their clothes, they have a resort like Caliente where everything's very expensive, everything's top of the line. Although my question is, if you're naked, how do people know that you have a lot of money? You know, how do they know what's in your pocket if you have no pockets? And then at the other end of this spectrum, there is what's known as the Bare Buns Biker Club, which just sounds painful to me. The word chafing comes to mind. And where you have sin, you have to have salvation as well. So there's a chapter of the book about religion in Florida. It mentions the Christ of the Abyss statue here in the Keys, where you can, if you feel like worshiping while you're out scuba diving or snorkeling, it's there. We have the mayor of Inglis, a town near Tampa, in 2001, officially banned Satan from her town. Somehow it did not prevent reporters from showing up to write about it. Miami, you may have heard, has a group of janitors known as the Voodoo Squad who arrive every morning and they clean up the chicken sacrifices and other animal sacrifices that have been left on the steps there, hoping to influence the outcome of various court cases. Again, not something you see in any other country, any other state in the nation. And I always like to mention Jim Baker. Do you remember Jim Baker? He and his wife Tammy Faye once were like the most prominent televangelists in the country. They were raking in so much money that Tammy Faye's dog lived in an air-conditioned doghouse. And Jim threw it all away. He met this church secretary named Jessica Hahn and took her to a place called the Sheraton Sand Key Resort in Clearwater Beach and had an affair with her there. And when it all came out, he pretty much lost everything. And of course then wound up in Florida, because that's the way it goes. But I have to mention that in this instance, when the news came out, people bombarded the Sheraton Sand Key Resort with phone calls and letters. They wanted to buy the sheets, they wanted to buy the shower curtain, they wanted to buy the pillows. I think this is one of those instances where the rest of the world went crazy and people in Florida said, "What's wrong with you people?" The most prominent clergyman to ever get into trouble in Florida was Martin Luther King. He was arrested in St. Augustine. He was arrested in 3 cities in America. One of them was here in Florida. It was in St. Augustine. He was here in 1964 leading protests against the way that discrimination had blocked Black residents in St. Augustine from participating in the celebration of St. Augustine's 500th anniversary. And the Klan was particularly angry about this. And the local leader of the protests, a guy named Robert Haling, he was a local dentist who worked on both white and black patients. They actually kidnapped him at one point and broke his fingers so he couldn't work anymore. But he continued protesting in spite of that. Dr. King, they burned down the house that he was staying in. They took all kinds of other actions. And so at one point, during the protests, he went to a very prominent hotel in downtown St. Petersburg, downtown St. Augustine, which would not allow Black people inside. And he went up to the door of their restaurant and asked to be admitted. He said, "I'm here to order food." And they said, "You can't come in." And he said, "Why not?" "Well, you just can't." And he said, "I'm determined to be treated like any other citizen." And they said, "We're not going to do that." And they called the cops. The cops show up. They arrested him for attempting to enter a whites-only establishment, hauled him off to the St. Augustine jail. Fast forward about 25 years, the Hilton people come in. They buy the motel. They say, "We're going to tear it down and build a brand new hotel. Isn't that wonderful?" And all the city officials are like, "Yay, Hilton!" And all the historic preservation people are like, "No, you can't do that. That's where Martin Luther King was arrested. This is terrible. This is a historic place." And so lawsuits were filed. Negotiations were entered into, and ultimately they came up with what I think is a very, very Florida solution, which was they were allowed to tear down the old motel, but they kept the steps. So, so if you're visiting St. Augustine, you can go visit the place where Martin Luther King was forced to stand while he was not being admitted into the restaurant that is no longer there. Speaking of arrests, we are very famous for all of our people who get arrested here. In fact, the very first, we really do have some of the craziest crooks anywhere. I put out a weekly newsletter called Oh Florida, the newsletter, and I routinely list the top 5 Oh Florida stories of the week, and I usually have a lot more than 5 to choose from, and a lot of them are from the police log. One of my favorites is the guy from Gainesville. The headline in the Gainesville Sun was "Man in Road Rage Incident Runs Over Self." But you know, the thing is, the TV show Cops was actually filmed here in Florida. Their first season was filmed entirely in Broward County, and I think people were like, "Is this fiction? What is this? What's going on here?" In one of the later seasons, they came back to Florida and they went along. They did a ride along with an officer who was supposed to be patrolling for prostitutes, and they got him to do it while dressed as a clown, and he would shoot silly string at the people he was arresting, and then their finishing touch was that he had to take an inhale from a helium balloon to tell him, "You're under arrest." I'm not sure that depicted a realistic view of how crime fighting works in Florida, but there you go. The concealed weapons law that we passed and our stand your ground law were both copied by a lot of other states, so that they've spread all over the place. But probably the most influential thing was a case that involved a couple of Miami Beach cops. These guys were tasked with patrolling the city's business district during the day, and then at night they would go back and break into those same businesses and steal from them. And the way that worked was one of them would stand lookout while the other one went in and, pried open the cash register, and they would communicate by walkie-talkie. Well, it just so happened that living in that same neighborhood was a ham radio operator, and one night he couldn't sleep, and so he got up and turned on his radio, and he started picking up their transmissions, and he said, "Oh my God, I'm listening to a robbery. This is insane." So he got a tape recorder and recorded the transmissions back and forth between the two guys, took it to the cops. Of course, the cops listened to it and go, "Hey, we know those voices. That's Bert and Ernie." So they arrest the cops, which happens a lot in Florida, and took them to trial. And their attorney, they were convicted, of course, but their attorney appealed the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the reason he did that is because during their trial, Florida was undergoing a 1-year test of allowing TV cameras in the courtroom to see if it would work. And so he was contending that having the TV cameras there prejudiced the jury against his clients. And of course, every news organization you could think of filed friend of the court briefs with the Supreme Court to argue, no, it didn't. And ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, yes, it's okay to have cameras in state courts. That's perfectly fine. And so that's why you could see Casey Anthony and O.J. Simpson being filmed in their courtroom adventures, because of 2 crooked cops in Florida and a ham radio operator who couldn't sleep. I mentioned about traffic getting its own chapter in Florida, and I think you'll have to agree with me that it deserved it. We are generally ranked as having the worst drivers in the United States. I think it's because we have all the drivers in the United States here all at one time. That's my argument. We do have the best road rage stories and car crash stories. One of them involving the Keys. There was a woman who was driving to a date in the Keys, and she had with her her ex-husband as a passenger. Not sure why he was there, but at one point she wanted to get in shape for her date, and so she asked him to take the wheel from the passenger side, and she pulled a razor out of her purse and began to shape up what the newspapers later referred to as her bikini area. It didn't end well. I'm just going to hasten to the ending. And that anecdote wound up in Dave Barry's next book, Carl Hyacин's next book, and my book. So do your own driving. Driving and shaving do not mix. That's my message to you. And car crashes, I should mention, by the way, have you heard of sudden elderly acceleration. That's a term that we reporters use sometimes, where people, I get confused sometimes about stuff. Where there were so many people who crashed into post offices one year that the post office actually ran public service announcements saying, "We do not have a drive-through window and we don't want one." But our need for speed in Florida is what gave birth to NASCAR. NASCAR started it here in 1947 in Daytona Beach. There's a guy named Bill France Jr. who really liked to turn left and then turn left again and then turn left again. And he gathered together a group of his friends, and they spent 3 days and hashed out the rules for what would become this multi-million-dollar effort to continue turning left a lot. And it's not like any other sport. Other sports, you have a commissioner picked by the team owners, and he presides over things. That's still a family operation. It's still run by the France family, just like it's a mom and pop grocery store. So at one point, the drivers tried to mount a revolt over their pay, and Bill France actually confronted them with a pistol and said, "Who wants some of this?" So it's a rough and tumble sport. Now, people ask me, what's the weirdest story you've ever heard? Is there any ultimate weird Florida story? And I have to tell them, no, we haven't quite hit that level of, nudity, gator / python, meth, that combination that the Florida Man Mad Libs has not been accomplished yet. But there are certain stories that if we had a Florida Weirdness Hall of Fame, these would go on the first ballot. One of them is the guy who was entered into a pet shop contest where the prize was a python, and the way you won the prize was by eating the most live cockroaches. And the good news is he won. The bad news is he died. And the medical examiner determined that he choked to death on insect parts. And my question was, how often do you check that box on the form, sir? Another one, there's a town called Gibsonton, which is populated largely by people who used to work as circus freaks, people who used to work in circus sideshow entertainment. One of them was a guy named Lobster Boy, so named because his hands had a certain deformity, and he promoted that as him being part lobster. He unfortunately retired, and when he came home, his wife decided she did not like him being at home all the time. It was not a good fit, and so she hired a teenage hitman to take him out. You know how people talk about that trial as a circus? This trial was literally a circus because everybody who testified was a circus performer or a retired circus performer. By the way, Gibsonton is the setting for my favorite X-Files episode, Humbug. So if you want to look that up sometime, I strongly recommend that. There's a classic one from right here in Key West. You may or may not be familiar with it. It's from back in 1930. There was a guy named Carl von Castle who pretended to be a count. He was more of a no account. And he was working as an X-ray technician, and he fell in love with one of his patients, the beautiful Maria. And his love for her transcended death, by which I mean, after she died, he dug up the body and took it home with him and continued to romance her. And after 9 years of this, her sister found out and, of course, was horrified, reported him to the authorities. He was arrested, put on trial, but he was acquitted because the statute of limitations had passed. So I'm not going to say anything more about that. I'll just leave it to your imagination. A more recent case was the Naughty Nympho case. You may or may not remember that. That's from Fort Lauderdale. The lady in the picture there, Kathy Willits, she was entertaining customers at home for pay, if you know what I mean. And what the customers didn't realize is that her husband was hiding in the closet with a video camera and a big yellow legal pad and taking notes, and of course taking video too. And at one point, he thought one of her customers was getting a little too chummy with her, and so he called the guy and left a voicemail in which he'd left very threatening statements. And so the customer reported the Willitses to the police, and the police raided the home, and that's when they discovered that Mr. Willits was actually Deputy Willits. He was a police officer, and that sort of set off everything, especially when it turned out that the Willitzes had all these videotapes and, of course, all these notes and a complete client list that they very desperately wanted to keep quiet. And more importantly, the clients wanted it kept quiet. So there was a lawsuit filed, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe versus the state of Florida. Some very smart entrepreneurs in Fort Lauderdale printed up T-shirts that said, "I'm not on the list," and sold out within hours. And the case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled if you're doing something naughty, you have no expectation of privacy. And so they ordered the list released to the press, and it turned out that at least one of the people on the list was a public official who was notorious for trying to shut down dirty bookstores. And oops. So, by the way, this story, it's the perfect example of the Florida story because it takes lots of twists and turns. There are lots of surprise elements to it. Just when you think it's as weird as it can get, it gets a little weirder. My favorite part of it is that their attorney attempted to use the defense that this was actually marriage counseling and marriage therapy for them. Apparently it worked. They're still together 20 years later. Now, people always ask me, why does Florida produce so much weird news? What is it? Is it something in the water? No, it's not in the water. I'm happy to say it's not in the water. But there are some very logical things that are going on. We were once, in 1940, we were the least populated southern state, which makes sense when you consider air conditioning was not very well used then, and of course there was lots and lots of mosquitoes. Well, now we're the third most populous state, so we've got 22 million people living here, and we have 100 million tourists coming every year. So you jam all those people together in such a short space of time, and remember, we're not evenly spread over the whole state. We're kind of crammed into that 30-mile wide swath along the coast and along I-4 where the theme parks are. They're bound to start, arguing with each other over whose dog pooped on whose lawn, chasing each other around with machetes, ramming in each other's cars. I mean, it's just logical. And think about who these people are. We have ex-CIA agents who wound up running the town of Sanibel. They helped to create the town of Sanibel, and one of them ended up becoming the mayor. We have the retired carnies I mentioned in Gibsonton. We have Hooters waitstaff. The first Hooters was created in Clearwater. We have python wranglers, monkey breeders, spam kings, strip club moguls, uniform Scientologists, and 29 electoral college votes, I should mention, by the way. And, our tropical climate means that we tend to be active year-round. It's not like Ohio or someplace like that where winter keeps people cooped up indoors. We're out all the time doing weird stuff, And also, I didn't believe this until I checked it myself. It turns out that the people who make machetes sell more of them in Florida than anywhere else. So when you see machetes turn up as a weapon in a story, that's why. Because we got them. And I always have to mention that we are routinely ranked 49th among the states for funding for mental illness treatment. So, the only thing I can say about that is thank God for Texas. But, here's the thing is I contend that we should embrace that weirdness. We should be happy about it because the same conditions that produce all that weirdness is what sparks our creativity and leads to us doing these things that influence the rest of the country. For example, the list of Florida men includes John Adanasoff. He grew up in Mulberry and was fascinated by his dad's slide rule. His dad was a phosphate mining engineer and always carried a slide rule. He was fascinated by it and wound up going to University of Florida, getting a degree in electrical engineering and inventing the computer, which of course is essential to all of us who like to play solitaire. The founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, started his very first business in Miami. If it had been a failure, if it had not been a success, would we now be dodging those drones dropping books in our heads? No. And of course, the most popular author you've probably never heard of, Donald J. Sobel, the creator of Encyclopedia Brown, he was a Florida man. He wrote all of these mysteries about this, as he called him, the Sherlock Holmes in sneakers, who would solve these various crimes because of his knowledge of like Civil War trivia and things like that. And he wrote a lot of these stories while living in Miami in the 80s during the whole cocaine cowboy era. So I picture him in the morning, he's eating his grapefruit for breakfast and reading the Miami Herald and seeing these stories about, drug dealers masquerading as cops, busted by cops masquerading as drug dealers. And this really happened. Drug dealers who were drug smugglers who had a plane load of cocaine, they're being pursued by a Coast Guard plane. They need to lighten their load, so they toss a bale of cocaine out of the plane, and it tumbles end over end and lands in the middle of a crime watch meeting in Homestead. Just barely missed the head of the police chief. That really happened. I picture him reading those stories and then going off to write another Encyclopedia Brown story about, him battling Bugs Meany, the town bully. But it's all Florida. It's all Florida stuff. And besides, and this is to me the most important point, who wants to live where it's boring? If you want to live somewhere where the news is the same day after day after day, move to Nebraska, move to one of those square states. But if you want to live in a place where every day you turn on the news or you open the paper and you go, wow, a guy punched a swan today, this is the place to be. And you should enjoy it, and you should be happy about it. Now, I have to mention that I've written some other books as well, other weird Florida tales. One of them is Cattail, The Wild Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther. It's actually yes, there's a lot of weirdness in it, but it's also a very heartwarming environmental tale that has a sort of a hopeful ending to it. And The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife, which is sort of the spiritual successor to Oh, Florida. I also wrote, I don't think I have it here tonight, but I wrote a book called The Sin of Scandal, Greed, Betrayal, and the World's Most Beautiful Orchid, which is about an orchid smuggling case that wound up involving Selby Gardens in Sarasota. They became the first scientific institution to ever be prosecuted for wildlife smuggling. And I always like to mention that book is classified as true crime / gardening, which I always feel bad for the bookstore clerks trying to figure out which shelf it goes on. So, thanks again for coming. Thanks so much, and I'll be out in front with the books.